right, we're back here on 89.5 WJMU The Quad. This is the Faculty Lounge. I'm Dr. Scott Lambert here with my wife, Jamie Whitmer, and Jason's over there in the corner. Hi again, Jason.
Hi again.
It was a fun hour. I enjoyed talking with her.
It was a fun hour. It was a fun hour. And for those who hadn't put, two and two together, she is Athena's mother. And Athena was on our show, a few weeks ago, talking about her experiences in London over the summer. So anyway, for folks who listen frequently, now you know why Athena is as cool as Athena is.
Yeah, the apple didn't fall far from that tree.
No, not at all.
So, I know this is not one of your favorite topics, but this has been a rough week for you.
This has been a rough week for me. I think I caught COVID-19 from my computer, I swear. And those of you who went to school with me, if you happen to be listening, this is like, it did dawn on me that once again, I seem to have the symptoms of something I'm studying. So anyway, but yeah, no, I've had a cold this week. It's been particularly miserable, but I am now back with the land of the living and excited to be back to work tomorrow. So
that'll be great.
And today was my scheduled day off, so I'm not home, sick today. So
yeah, you still probably would have been home today, though. It's been rough. This happens.
It does. It happens.
This happens, and as I told my class today, with you, there's a big difference because you're like all medical professionals. You are not the greatest patient. You don't drink nearly as many fluids as you're supposed to. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I'm not a very good patient, but such
but
is life.
as we said, I have not had my bout of the man flu yet this year. My students are waiting for it because I tell them that every year I come down with something very minimal, and it's the worst thing that ever happened to anyone. Some of them think that's very funny. I don't know why.
You are, you're
A bit
uniquely dramatic when you're sick.
Yes. Just a
Yes.
little bit.
It's okay though. People I think in general are actually pretty dramatic when they're sick.
So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the cruise ship, because I think that's something that's really you've been paying a lot of attention to.
Yeah. So COVID-19, just as a to back up just a bit. COVID-19 is a coronavirus. It's novel, meaning it's new. It was first identified December 31st, 2019 in Wuhan, China. And as of today, we are up to 75,751 cases worldwide. 74,675 of those cases are located in China. And there have been, as of today, 2,121 deaths. So this particular coronavirus has a higher fatality rate than we see with most coronaviruses. Most of the time, they account for 5 to 30% of the colds, that we see every year. There were 2 prior coronavirus outbreaks, SARS and MERS, which were particularly lethal. So this isn't completely unprecedented, but what is unprecedented is the level of contagion with this, even though it's not as, the fatality rate is not what we saw with SARS or MERS. It appears to be much more contagious. So it's been kind of a big story this year.
Yeah, and the cruise ship.
So the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, which is a cruise ship owned by Princess Cruise Lines, which, the sister, or the parent company also owns Carnival Cruises, had about 3,711 people on board, including passengers and crew. Someone who got on the ship and then got off of the ship. It was one of these cruises where you had some people getting on at different times throughout the cruise and then disembarking at different times. one of the folks who got on the ship and then later got off of the ship, after getting off of the ship, tested positive for COVID-19. And due to the fact that it's so contagious, the passengers on board were quarantined for 2 weeks in Yokohama, Japan, just offshore. And unfortunately what happened was that this kind of turned into a super spread event. So as of now, we have more than 600 people who were on that ship have tested positive for COVID-19. So about 17 to 19% of the people on board have now tested positive. So that's a much higher rate than what we would typically see. We're thinking that folks with COVID-19 on average spread this to 1 to 2.5 people. So, you know, whatever happened on that ship was different than what we're seeing, you know, elsewhere. And it also underscores the notion that if there's a virus on a ship, it will spread like fire. You know, we see this with norovirus. It's just very hard to contain any type of highly contagious illness. It's very hard to contain on a cruise ship.
Now, I've been, you know, at work today, and one of the things that I saw come across, and I haven't read, you know, as much as I would like, but I guess the CDC has been unhappy because those people who, the Americans that we brought home, came off the ship and flew on a plane with...
Yeah. So the idea was that the United States kind of led the way in terms of getting folks home. There were around 400 passengers that were Americans on the ship. The United States sent two planes to get them a couple of days before the quarantine on board was completed. And they were told that no one who had contracted the virus would be going home. So basically, if you were diagnosed with COVID-19, you were going to be staying in a Japanese healthcare facility until you were well. So the planes arrived, you know, the buses go to pick up the passengers. Passengers disembark the ship. After they're off the ship, they're put on these buses, and they sit, and they sit, and they sit. And like 2 hours later, they're still sitting on the buses. It's like, what is going on? Well, what happened was, after the passengers were off the ship, it turned out that 14 of them had tested positive for COVID-19. So their results came in after they had disembarked, but before they were on the plane. And there was a big brouhaha stateside on, you know, what do we do with these 14 folks? And Washington Post is reporting that the director of the CDC said, absolutely not. They need to be cared for in Japan, because we've already told folks that we're not going to transport individuals home who are sick with this and subject them to potentially an even higher level of exposure on a long distance air flight. There were folks with another agency in the administration that said no, they should be able to fly home because we already have containment areas on the planes that are separate from where the general population will be, and we had already planned to move folks if they became symptomatic in flight into these areas, which were, from the picture shown, they had walls and a ceiling, and it was an isolation room, essentially, was what it was. So the CDC was effectively overruled, and everybody flew back. About 300 United States citizens, or a little more than 300, accepted the government's offer to fly home. Those who did not accept the offer have to not travel home until March 4th, which would be another, 14 days from when they would have flown to the United States. And the folks that came back are at Lackland Air Force Base and Travis, or Lackland Joint Base and Travis Air Force Base. And then, of course, the folks that were sick are being treated, in healthcare facilities.
But with those 14 and then loose in the bus at the time, and those buses held there, doesn't that make all 300?
It's a concern, it is a concern to me. I think the folks first of all, for the general public, the risk is very low because these folks are in quarantine. So anybody that was exposed during transport is going to be quarantined at these Air Force bases for 2 weeks. The 14 that had tested positive and flew home, on these flights, repatriation flights, are now being treated at healthcare facilities. So outside of the folks that flew home, our risk is minimal. But for the folks that were potentially on the buses, with them and so forth, yes, they've been exposed. However, when you're on a ship that 20% of the population has tested positive for, you could also make the argument that these folks had already been exposed in, maybe not the majority of the cases, but there was, a percentage of the cases that, they've already been exposed. So yes, lots of concerns, of course, from the CDC. The director of the CDC was concerned enough, in fact, that they made sure that the CDC wasn't on the statement at all, saying that, what had happened, that these 14 folks had been flown home anyway. They didn't want anybody to think that the CDC had cleared that. So, time will tell how that plays out. There's also, the big debate on, did the quarantine fail? Well, it depends on how you're looking at the quarantine. So when we quarantine folks, quarantine is to keep the folks who haven't been exposed to something, to keep them from getting exposed. So when you look at it from that light, up until today and yesterday, while you weren't keeping transmission on board from happening, you were keeping the coronavirus on the ship, instead of, everybody getting off of the ship and, that type of thing, and dispersing off to the various countries. Most of the countries, for the folks who were disembarked and went home, a lot of the countries are requiring an additional quarantine, such as the United States and so forth. But there are countries, such as apparently Japan, in which they're not being absolutely required to quarantine themselves for an extra 14 days. And to me, that is much the bigger concern with this. Because you have a scenario where there appears to have been active transmission ongoing. There were new cases reported just yesterday, if not today. And so those folks get off the ship and they're just, poof. Now, Japan did come out and say that they are recommending that their citizens who have gotten off that ship kind of self-quarantine at home, avoid going out in public and so forth for 14 days, but they're not requiring it.
Okay.
And that, to me, is the much bigger concern, than these 14 patients or passengers who were flown home in a containment area. I mean, yes, it's a concern for the folks on the bus, but for the greater, population beyond just those folks, not so much.
Okay.
So, the other thing that we had been following was, and I wrote about, was these hero doctors in Japan, and that's been really interesting
Yeah,
as
it is.
well. Dr. Li Wenliang had been widely hailed as a hero whistleblower doctor. He had reported on a chat room that there were cases of a SARS-like outbreak in Wuhan at the hospital he was working at. And he was questioned formally by the police in China. And basically forced to sign an agreement saying, I promise not to spread rumors, and so forth. And then it was just a couple days later that, the novel coronavirus was confirmed. It turns out there were 2 other doctors who played a central role in bringing awareness to COVID-19. One was Dr. Jixian Zhang, and the other one was Dr. Dingyu Zhang. Jixian Zhang was the head of the respiratory department at Hubei Provincial Hospital in Wuhan, and noticed on December 26th a few cases that came to the hospital. It was actually a couple came to the hospital with respiratory symptoms and so forth, and their CT scan findings had an appearance that wasn't consistent with influenza or any type of typical pneumonia. And just kind of, she had worked with SARS years ago and just felt unsettled, and so she knew that their son had been taking care of them. She called the son and said, hey, come in here. And out of an overabundance of caution, had a CT scan done on him, even though he wasn't having symptoms, and lo and behold, he had these same infectious CT findings, which are kind of a ground glass appearance in both lungs. So she knew, that there's a problem with this situation. And then the next day, there were 3 or 4 extra cases that came in. And she went to the hospital administration and said, hey, look, we have a problem. This is what's going on. This reminds me of SARS. We need to take this really seriously. The hospital did a review fairly quickly, and that day notified the Chinese authorities that there was an infectious concern. It looked like something new. And so the Chinese authorities became involved right away. Dr. Dingyu Zhang was the president of a hospital also in Wuhan, and on the 29th received 7 patients from another smaller hospital. I haven't been able to confirm that these were Jixian Zhang's patients, but the timeline is curious to me. And at his hospital, that became kind of ground zero for the COVID-19 outbreak. And the people at the hospital, including Dr. Dingyu Zhang, worked tirelessly, and I'm sure still are, to treat patients and to keep the authorities informed and so forth. So it's quite the story. And it also brings to mind that Dr. Jixian Zhang made an official report to administration, which is kind of the proper channels to report such a case, versus Dr. Li Wenliang was concerned and went on to a chat room and said, hey, this is what's going on in my hospital. We have these cases that look like SARS. For folks listening to this not aware, China has not always been a good actor globally. Their response to SARS was an absolute travesty. They didn't fess up to the fact that they had an infectious disease problem that was new and spreading until way too late, or way too long, much longer than they should have. And they also have a real freedom of speech issue too. But in this case, if you look at this retrospectively, it does appear, and I'm not saying that the Chinese authorities were correct for questioning a physician about, warning the public or his contacts that there might be something infectious going on. But there is a difference between reporting that to appropriate authorities and channels versus just going into a chat room and saying, you know, whatever. Now, being an American, I think, yes, we should be able to go onto a chat room and say whatever we want. But it's not the Chinese culture.
Okay.
You know.
Here's another thing that I've been interested in and that you've kind of got me interested in. That's the case of the Abels.
Yes. So David and Sally Abel, I think we talked about this a little bit last time.
We did.
They were passengers on the Diamond Princess, developed international fame with their Facebook and then eventually YouTube vlog posts outlining their experiences while quarantined on the Diamond Princess. Unfortunately, just a couple of days ago, both were tested positive for COVID-19 and are now in a hospital. You know, based on pictures that they've posted, they appear to be doing well, but it's been interesting to watch that as well. And there were media issues there too, and of course here I am, like we're talking about them, and so this may be wrong too, but I think their big concerns with the media is they're from Britain, and the media in Britain can be much more intrusionistic, if that's a word, than maybe even the media in the United States. Intrusive. And, you know, the media in Britain was doing things like going to their village and videoing stuff in their village, and there was a crew that actually went to their pharmacy, which is like so far beyond the pale I can't imagine it. And so there's been, interesting for you, there's been all sorts of underlying media issues throughout this whole thing. What have your thoughts been on the media coverage?
Well, again, media or the press in England is different than it is in the United States. The rules are different. Libel rules and libel laws are different. That being said, I still can't see what you're going to get from this other than they want to know. These people became celebrities. And they became celebrities over something that is kind of interesting. I guess you would say they've been thrust into the spotlight, which is important if you're talking about U.S. law and public figures or public, public figures, because that would take away some of their protections. They posted, or he posted, a lot of videos that explained how they were doing, what they were doing. He had a lot of fun with it. I don't think he was having fun with it at the end. His last couple of days, he was really kind of cranky. But when you saw how British media approached it, you also have to understand, this wasn't
This was not the BBC and the main, right.
This was your tabloids, and the tabloids in England, they're paparazzi. They are out there, they are intrusive, they will go out and take pictures. They're the people that chased Princess Diana into the tunnel. They're the people that did a lot of things. I mean, these are the people that took shots of, what's her name?
The Duchess of Cambridge, topless on top of it.
Away.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what they do. That's been the approach to it, and that's, what tabloid journalism it always is and always will be. But it's different from the way it is here. It's more intrusive, and that's just.
How do you think the U.S. media's done covering this?
Well, I haven't seen any celebrity type of stories about this. They didn't have anybody. We haven't had anybody that really broke out the way he did on social media. We did have that one couple that were on Fox News complaining about everything. I think they complained about not getting enough bottled water when there was water right there in their rooms, stuff along those lines. But
I think the media's done a pretty good job with this story.
You know, the thing that I find interesting, you've found this person on Facebook who is from the UK, and he's in Wuhan. He's still in Wuhan.
He's from Wuhan originally, or from China originally. Has been working as an assistant professor in the UK, and he went home to visit his parents for the Chinese New Year holiday, and now he's been quarantined in Wuhan.
And, you know, you've been showing some of this stuff, but what he does is really interesting, because he's written some stuff that has explained how media works in China, as well as how media is working here. The United States has not picked up on the story of the hero doctors that you're talking about. Those came from the China Review, or the Hong Kong Review.
The Hindustan Times, and there was international media who have picked up that case, but it hasn't been picked up in America, and I'm kind of surprised about that, because we like a good hero story.
Yeah, but America right now, America is looking at COVID as something that could be an annoyance. You know, the flu is still going to kill more people in the United States.
And that's true. That's true. Yeah, and in fact...
And in the United States, just like in most countries, if you've got this, I guess the people that it kills, there's not much that they can do to, prevent it. But if you are doing everything that you do in the hospital, most of the people are going to make it out.
So with COVID-19, 80% of cases are very mild, and probably not much different than the cold I've just had. 20% of the cases, though, are very severe, and can involve like respiratory failure and things like that in this kind of strange pneumonia. 2% or less, between 1 and 2% of the cases are fatal. And you're right, like once they go down that multiple organ failure picture, we're not seeing tons of people pull out of that, although I do believe that there have been some cases. There has been, or are ongoing clinical trials with some HIV medications, remdesivir, as well as lopinavir and ritonavir. And preliminary results on those trials should be available within the next few weeks. But point being, you're absolutely correct. In the United States, unless something changes, influenza is a much bigger threat. We've had 26 million flu cases this year so far, as of the week ending February 8th. 250,000 hospitalizations, 14,000 deaths, and 92 deaths amongst children. So, when you put into perspective that there's like 75,751 cases of COVID-19 worldwide, and the vast majority of those cases are still isolated in China, the influenza is a much, 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 much bigger concern, and yet COVID-19 is getting all of the airtime because it is new, and none of us have any type of immunities built up for it.
Right.
So, so I think that they're both a concern, and I think, it's a good time to just reiterate, we need to be washing our hands all the time. When we cough, we should cough into our elbow instead of into our hands. If we're sick, we need to stay home. If we're around someone who looks like they're not doing so well, they're coughing, that type of thing, staying 6 feet away from them is a really good idea, because most of this is spread via droplets. Influenza can hang out in the air a little bit longer than most coronaviruses. COVID-19, the verdict is, it's not back in on that yet, totally. But the most important thing is to wash your hands, and stay home when you're sick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. So that's what we've been looking at. Those are some of the things that we've been talking about.
I do think that the U.S. media has done a good job, though, in terms of reporting fact and reporting,
The Washington Post has something about coronavirus every day. So does Politico. So does the AP. Most of them
CNN.
have something that's going out every day about what's happening, and they have not been making it something that's more dangerous than it sounds. They're just explaining and writing about where things are. They will tell you about the latest deaths. I guess 2 of the people from the cruise ship died, or a couple of people, and that's the first from the actual cruise ship. They are interested in the cruise ship because that's where the Americans were. And, I just think the whole idea of this cruise ship as basically a breeding ground for coronavirus, because they were all there, and it's a great story of a wonderful attempt at quarantine that failed spectacularly.
Well, it didn't fail until they let everybody off the ship in the past 48 hours that it tested negative. So, and I don't know how many people that involved, how many Japanese were on that ship. We know that there's several Americans that elected not to take the flight home, the repatriation flight, and so forth. And those folks are just allowed off the ship, and they're being encouraged to stay home for 14 days and go avoid unnecessary travel. But there were 2 Americans that were on that ship, and this morning gave an interview saying that they were going sightseeing. And
Yeah.
that to me makes the quarantine kind of not entirely all for naught, but it diminishes the point being that you were trying to contain everything on this ship. Now, were you also trying to avoid transmission from people to people? Yes, but again, the first and foremost concern with the Japanese authorities initially was they can't get off this ship because we don't want to infect our population. It was effective for that until folks were allowed to get off and just go straight out when we knew that transmission was ongoing. For the quarantine to be effective, you really need to be isolated for 14 days after your last known exposure, which is what we think the incubation period is. Could there be some cases that pop up beyond the 14 days? That's always possible, but the statistics really, really diminish after that. CDC, WHO, all of the main authorities that are really paying attention to this believe that it's those first 14 days. And in fact, it's usually in the first week that most folks are developing symptoms, So the fact that on day 14, you still have people testing positive in fairly high enough numbers that would be unexpected, there's enough evidence for ongoing transmission that you would hope anybody getting off of that ship would be quarantined, in their homes, or like what the United States is doing by putting folks up in an Air Force base. I think the big concern on the ship too was that this was not a medical facility by any stretch of the imagination.
No, it's a cruise ship.
It's a cruise ship, but there weren't infectious disease specialists that came on board. There weren't standard infectious disease protocols being followed, and that's where the problem comes in. So I think it was a really, really good idea, and I think that the intentions were good, but possibly the execution here was not so great.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. This is a situation that no doubt will be studied for years to come by virologists and epidemiologists and,
All kinds of
ologists to kind of figure out, what went wrong, what could we have changed, I would not be surprised that this somehow comes back to food. Did you have folks that have been, that had the virus that were preparing food or handling the food in terms of taking it from the cooking area to the rooms, that type of thing? I think that that's much more likely than some of these kind of conspiracy theories, like it was going through the ventilation systems. It's always possible that happens, but it's much more likely that who touched the plate and then handed it over to other people. There were other things that they were doing that were like not so great, like having passengers sign an informed consent for testing on a piece of paper that was then handed back to the personnel who weren't necessarily prepared to handle that type of thing, and just putting it in a stack. And then there was lots of things that made infectious disease folks go, oh my goodness, this is not good.
Right. So let's jump off this topic for a minute here on 89.5 WJMU The Quad. I'm 20 minutes late with that, but hey, I did it. The debate. Oh my goodness. It was really the first. I've watched parts of them, but I didn't want to watch them till the new year started. This was the first one that I really watched from beginning to end, and it was just so much fun. It was so much fun. They had the knives out. They were throwing chairs at each other. I was waiting for everything to come in, and they just beat up poor little Mike Bloomberg. It was horrible. I felt bad for him. Not really. I want to see what he does next. Elizabeth Warren was just wonderful. It was great, except, what happens now?
Yeah, so who do you think shone last night?
Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren is the person that I would so love to vote for. If it was any other year, she would be my choice 100 times over, and I still kind of want to vote for her now, but I'm so scared to put her up against the Donald Trump. I don't know if that's sexist and if that makes me sexist for saying that, but
I don't think it does. It's not that you're sexist. It's just you're worried about the voting demographic.
Yeah,
and that's honestly because if you're putting up what we have against, sadly, a set that has been showing to get less votes against something that we've already had to deal with for a long time.
Yeah.
I understand that. I mean, we already had this fight when it happened in the last election.
Yeah. I don't know. What'd you think of Elizabeth Warren? I know you like her.
I think Elizabeth Warren was brilliant. I think she came out swinging. She immediately went after Bloomberg, and then she proceeded to go after so many other people too.
She went after everybody.
And I don't know that I like that necessarily. I think Mayor Pete is brilliant and thoughtful. I do have concerns regarding experience, but we could have said the same about Barack Obama as well.
No, Barack Obama was a senator.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can run the country.
It may not, but there's a difference between senator and mayor of Indiana.
Yeah, this is true. This is true. I'm just saying though that in terms of years and service and things like that, you can make an argument that Mayor Pete wasn't the first person
with absolutely no experience.
With no experience.
I mean, look at Trump. He had absolutely none. But then again, look at Trump and see what you have with someone with absolutely no experience.
Well, yes. And then you have Amy Klobuchar, who is really appears to be very, very intelligent. I thought when Mayor Pete tried to go after her for momentarily forgetting the president of Mexico's name, I think that actually ended up looking worse on him than it did her. Because I think that she owns her imperfections, and that's really reassuring. too many of them will try to weasel their way around or whatever. And she's like, no, I just messed up. The guy's name just slipped my mind, at the wrong time. So I think she's intriguing. I would love to see Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar on a ticket together. Don't think it's going to happen. I know that you think Cory Booker, if Joe Biden were to get the nomination, Cory Booker should be his partner. And I think at this point in time, both of us are thinking Joe Biden is much less of a shiny object than he was 3 months ago.
I think Joe Biden looks old. And there are a lot of old white men running.
And you know what? We shouldn't, like, that to me should not be exclusionary criteria, because the president is an old white man. So,
Right.
in that matchup, you're apples to apples, so.
But I'm going to say something that's going to attack my liberal cred, and I understand that. But the fact of the matter is that, if you want to pick one person that could beat Bloomberg as much as he got beat up yesterday, or beat Trump as much as he got beat up yesterday, Michael Bloomberg would beat Trump. He would beat Trump hands down every time you look at it. I don't think there's any way that he wouldn't. But the question is that what the Democratic Party really needs to do? And do we need to go, I don't want to say sell ourselves out, but to go that far just to beat Trump? Now, my answer to that is, yeah, I don't care. I want him out because Michael Bloomberg has warts, but Michael Bloomberg's warts are not like what Trump's are. And
But to me, if you're going to go centrist, go with Amy Klobuchar. Or go with Mayor Pete.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And I don't mean centrist, because, not like Bloomberg, but if you really want, and I mean, frankly, even Joe Biden.
Sure, except for none of them has shown that they have the ability to beat Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And that is just, to me, that is, Bernie's the guy that, man, I think he's got good ideas, and if you had a pipe dream, great, but it's not going to get, his ideas aren't going to get through Congress. And I'm looking for someone who aligns with my ideals, but is also going to be realistic in terms of getting stuff done,
Yeah.
And I think that Joe Biden, as much as I hate to say it, Bloomberg, Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar probably fit that bill for me. But my goodness, I love Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
I know I've just named everybody except for Bernie Sanders.
I would vote for Bernie Sanders over Trump.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to vote against Donald Trump.
There you go.
But aside from that, I guess my takeaway was, when I say that I'm going to name everybody, my takeaway last night was actually, there's a bunch of people up there that I'd be willing to vote for. And that's the first time I remember that happening for me.
Right. I wrote something earlier today about that, and I went through every single one of my primary votes that I've made in my life. And I remember them because every primary until this one, I knew exactly who I wanted to vote for. They didn't always win the nomination, but I knew exactly who I wanted to vote for and why I wanted to vote for them. And I had a thought process, and there it was. But
usually, I kind of was the same way, but for me, usually it was because that was the only person that I thought was worth voting for. In this situation, I don't know who I'm going to vote for yet entirely, because there's a few people that I think could do this. I really don't want it to be Bloomberg, and I'm not as convinced as you are that he would beat Trump. I'm becoming increasingly fearful that it doesn't matter who we nominate that we're not going to beat Trump. You know, I feel like we're becoming a little fragmented, but I'm hoping that once we do have a nominee that the party will come back together. But one of the problems that you have with so many people still running is that we are becoming fragmented.
Yeah, but you know, that can be looked at in two ways. I heard a lot of people, or I saw a lot of people today making the comment that, you know, all of this is a circular firing squad. We're giving Trump ammunition. Well, Trump's already got all that ammunition. We need whoever comes out of this to be strong and to be used to getting hit from just about everywhere they can for about every reason they can. And the more they get hit going through the primary, the stronger they will be going into the general.
And that is my concern, actually, with Joe Biden, is he just doesn't think on his feet
No.
and communicate effectively when he's under fire on live TV. Now, that said, I thought he did fine last night. I thought he had a really strong showing last night, and I was comfortable with his performance last night. But he has repeatedly, in previous debates, shown that he's not as quick on his feet. And be that fair criticism or not, it is what is going to be seen to the public
As being old.
well as being old, but it's also, you know, he's got to go up against Trump debating and so forth. But then I think, you know, Donald Trump was such a disaster at debates, and he's still, you know, here we
Yeah.
are. So, you know, it might be two bad debaters against each other, you know.
Yeah,
But Trump's going to be lobbing this nonsense at him, and I don't think he's got the ability to land on his feet every time and, you know, stay, keep his messaging on track.
Yeah.
I think Elizabeth Warren certainly can. I think Michael Bloomberg showed, at the very least showed, even though I thought his performance was kind of flat, showed that he doesn't get ruffled too much and get off track too much. He seemed to, you know, stuff that was getting thrown at him was kind of deflected off. You know, he did come across as having very thick skin. And I think Amy Klobuchar comes across as somebody who can think on her feet.
You know, the fact of the matter is, I wrote this earlier today, I think if it got to the general, Amy Klobuchar would have a better chance than Elizabeth Warren does. I think that Elizabeth Warren is far and away my favorite. I don't know if I'll vote for her, but she's far and away my favorite. She's the person, out of that entire group, she's the person in my mind that is most qualified to be president. But qualified to be president and being president aren't the same thing.
And I think everybody on that podium last night, actually, you know I said that, well, it doesn't matter what I said. I think everybody's qualified by general terms, especially, you know, as you said, when you compare them and their qualifications to what Donald Trump had before he won the presidency. Certainly everybody's prepared.
Yeah.
I do think Michael Bloomberg and maybe Amy Klobuchar are the two that have the best chance of pulling those Republicans that are disgruntled and can't handle Trump, maybe pulling some of them over. Like, you know, former President Bush may vote for Bloomberg over you know, Trump. I mean, people like
former
that.
President Bush will vote for anybody over Trump.
Well, or he just won't vote.
Or he
but
won't vote. And
but
that's
what
the
I'm
thing.
saying is, folks that were in the Bush camp, that were Bush Republicans, you know, I think Mayor Bloomberg and Amy Klobuchar have a better chance of pulling those folks in to vote for them. Certainly more so than Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. I think that they are just too far of a stretch for anyone who's, you know, a true centrist. That's just too far.
Oh yeah.
However, you know, when you have the choice, if you're a centrist, between Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren, you know, what are you going to do?
Right. I understand.
I mean, you know, for me, it's far and away Elizabeth Warren in that scenario, but
You never know.
that's me.
All right, we're out of time.
All right.
That's always a sad moment for you. You just look so bummed when we're out of time. You're like, oh.
Yeah, tonight I'm ready to go home and go to bed.
Okay.
Feel that.
All right, so we are out of here for tonight. We'll be back next week. I do not have a guest lined up at this moment. We won't be here next week.
Yeah, next week is our dark week.
Yeah, we'll be taking the week off, so it'll be 2 weeks.
No, I won't be back that next week.
So, and then Jason won't be back.
Yeah,
I don't know what we'll do.
I'll be hopefully winning some awards. So.
Oh, yes, and that is the last thing that we do need to talk about, because in 2 weeks Jason will be off for
New York.
New York
IBS.
and the IBS, which is,
Intercollegiate Broadcasting Systems.
and they'll be getting their awards, or
We'll be doing that Friday or that Saturday night, which is the 7th.
and this weekend my Decaturian students head up to Chicago for the Illinois Collegiate Press Awards.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping they do a good job and get a number of awards. I think they've done a great job this year. I'm extremely proud of them, no matter what happens. But
Yeah,
I'd like to see them get
and they've
recognized.
got some stuff to go through this year, and they've still, produced some killer material.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, we'll see you guys next week, or in 2 weeks on the Faculty Lounge on 89.5 WJMU, the Quad.